Hello everyone. Today we will be looking at the attempts of Europeans during the Cold War to differentiate themselves politically from the US and from the USSR. In particular, we will be honing in on two political movements, Gaullism and Euro-communism, asking how both sought to create a European third way. In the 1950s, US influence in Western Europe was as strong as Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Whilst American businessmen flocked to the continent to invest in real estate, and GIs were shipped over to serve in large bases in West Germany, the UK, and Italy, ordinary Europeans spent much of their free time watching Hollywood movies and dancing to Bill Haley or to Elvis. Many Europeans, however, resented the US presence on the continent. In particular, nationalists and communists tended to oppose the US, whilst centrists supported it. The nationalist backlash would be felt from 1958 in France, where former General Charles de Gaulle made himself president. Charles de Gaulle has already been mentioned a couple of times in this course. He was a general serving in the French army in 1940 when the German offensive overwhelmed France and captured Paris. After this catastrophe, de Gaulle fled to England, where he founded the so-called Free French, a French government in exile committed to continuing the war with Germany. De Gaulle's relationship with both the British and the US during the war were strained. He often acted independently without consultation, and always put French needs above the needs of the Allies as a whole. Still, he retained Churchill and General Eisenhower's support, and French soldiers played their part in the 1944 invasion of Normandy. De Gaulle entered Paris in triumph later that year. He then led two governments which oversaw the transition of France through the end of the war into peacetime. De Gaulle dramatically resigned in 1946, upset with the bickering of the French political parties. He became a figure of opposition in France, vigorously campaigning against the constitution of the so-called Fourth Republic. In 1947, he formed the Rally of the French People, a political party that fought against both the Republic and the Communists, who, as we shall see, were strong in France at the time. After retiring for 3 years, de Gaulle made a return to politics as a result of the Algerian war crisis, managing to overthrow the Fourth Republic entirely and usher in a new system, the Fifth Republic, where the president had unchecked powers. This was convenient for de Gaulle as he himself became the first president under this system. After stabilizing France by withdrawing from Algeria, de Gaulle set about restoring France's national prestige. In order to do this, he felt that he needed to make France as separate as possible from both the US and from the Soviet Union. One way to do this was to develop a separate nuclear deterrent, France's own nuclear weapons that it could fire without the permission of others. De Gaulle cancelled the previous nuclear research France was conducting with West Germany and with Italy, fearing the effect on public opinion if the Germans were able to get their hands on the bomb. He then threw government money at the problem, creating a force de frappe. In 1960, the French successfully detonated a nuclear bomb in the Sahara Desert. The French then secretly funded the Israeli nuclear weapons project without permission of the United States. De Gaulle also set out to improve relations with West Germany as a way to diminish the influence of the US and of the UK in that country. De Gaulle's supporters in West Germany were known as Europeanists, whereas his rivals were the Atlanticists who supported America. The Europeanists' greatest achievement was signing the Franco-German Friendship Treaty in 1963, in which eternal friendship of the two countries was proclaimed. The Kennedy administration in the US watched all of this happen with consternation and anger, fearing the loss of their influence in Europe. De Gaulle's most maverick and unexpected move was to pull France out of NATO's command structure. In other words, US generals and admirals could no longer tell France where to go and who to fight. Whilst reassuring other NATO countries that France would support them in case of a Soviet attack, de Gaulle had no wish for French troops and infrastructure to be used in a war that did not concern France. This was awkward for two reasons. One, NATO's European headquarters were in Paris, and two, much of NATO's supply lines to the front in West Germany ran through eastern France. In other words, de Gaulle's decision caused much chaos behind NATO front lines and a massive and costly reorganization project. France only rejoined NATO's integrated command in 2009. By the middle of the 1960s, de Gaulle's hold on power and his status on the world stage seemed unassailable. The French president was a massive nuisance for NATO. He constantly lectured the US on their involvement in Vietnam and even travelled to Canada to call for a free Quebec. The French people, meanwhile, seemed content with the prosperity and order that accompanied his paternalistic rule. Beneath the surface, however, basic discontent persisted and was startlingly revealed by the crisis that erupted in May 1968. Student disorders in the universities of the Paris region had been sporadic for some time, with students resenting poor accommodation, sex-based segregation, and poor job prospects. Student dissatisfaction exploded on May the 3rd when a rally of radicals at the prestigious Sorbonne University became violent and was broken up by the police. This minor incident quickly became a major confrontation. Barricades went up in Paris's Latin Quarter, street fighting broke out, and the Sorbonne was occupied by student rebels who converted it into a giant commune. This unrest spread to other universities and then, crucially, to the factories as well. A wave of wildcat strikes rolled across France, eventually involving several million workers and paralyzing the nation. The Prime Minister ordered the police to evacuate the Latin Quarter and concentrated on negotiations with labor union leaders. An agreement calling for improved wages and working conditions was hammered out, but it collapsed when ordinary workers refused to end their strike. By the end of May, various radical factions openly declared their wish to carry out a true revolution that would bring down the Fifth Republic. De Gaulle seemed incapable of grappling with the crisis, complaining, "No one listens to me anymore." The communists and trade union leaders, however, helped de Gaulle. They opposed further upheaval, evidently fearing the loss of their followers to anarchist rivals. The Soviet Union, after all, supported the French leader for the disruption that he had brought to NATO. In addition, many middle-class citizens who had initially enjoyed the excitement lost their enthusiasm as they saw established institutions disintegrating before their eyes. De Gaulle then suddenly left Paris by helicopter on May 29th and returned the next day with a promise of armed support, if it was needed, from the commanders of the French occupation forces in Germany. In a dramatic radio address, he appealed for law and order and presented himself as the only barrier to anarchy or communist rule. Nervous citizens rallied round him. The activist factions were isolated when the communists refused to join them in an armed uprising. On June 23rd and the 30th, the Gaullists won a landslide electoral victory. Still, the repercussions of May 1968 were considerable. Workers were granted higher wages and improved conditions, and university education was reformed. De Gaulle silently abandoned his office in April 1969, dying of a stroke a year later. Europeans who opposed the United States, capitalism, and NATO in 1950 would most likely have looked up to and supported the US's Cold War rival, the Soviet Union. Indeed, with its full employment and dramatic scientific achievements, such as the launch of the satellite Sputnik in 1956, the Soviet Union appeared as an attractive model for an alternative world system. However, the Soviets lost much of their support through the crushing of revolutions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and their support for the building of the Berlin Wall. Meanwhile, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Soviet build-up of its military strength convinced many pacifists that that country was just as much a threat to peace in Europe as NATO was. The Soviet leadership also increasingly appeared to be working with Western leaders to keep the rigid Cold War system in place. Gradually, even communists in Western Europe, who had long received their orders from Moscow, began looking for a way to remove themselves from Soviet influence. The French communists had earned much prestige and support for their actions during the Second World War, where they had provided some of the strongest resistance to the German occupation, even if this resistance only began in earnest after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. The French Communist Party, the PCF, was modelled along the lines of Stalin's Communist Party and was run in a rigidly hierarchical fashion. During the Fourth Republic, the party assumed an oppositional and troublemaking role, mostly focusing on dominating the trade union movement in France. Many younger workers found the old communists controlling the unions to be just as deaf to their concerns and complaints as the factory bosses were. Under de Gaulle, the PCF was increasingly institutionalized, as seen in the refusal to offer much support in the 1968 revolution. Rather, it exerted pressure upon the government in secret, winning concessions both for workers and for union leaders. The Communist Party was a member of subsequent socialist governments, but gradually lost its power and status through years of inaction and stagnation. Communism in Italy was both stronger at its peak than in France and remained influential for longer, due in large part to its principled opposition to Mussolini. Indeed, the Communist Party, the PCI, were one of the two most powerful political entities that dominated Italy during the Cold War, alongside the centre-right Christian Democrats. Until the 1970s, the PCI received its orders from Moscow, with whom it worked closely. The Christian Democrats, with the support of the US, skillfully managed to keep the PCI from any political power, although the party were able to help form the Italian constitution. Despite a couple of failed local uprisings launched following right-wing violence against them, the communists continued to elaborate an Italian road to socialism that ruled out violent insurrection and called for progressive reform. Economic strife in the 1960s, however, led to the hot autumn of 1969, a season of strikes, factory occupations, and mass demonstrations throughout northern Italy. Many of these occurred without the input or prior knowledge of the communists, much to their embarrassment. Communists throughout Europe saw the slow reaction to the French and Italian Communist parties to 1968 and 1969 as evidence that a new, more vibrant communist policy was needed. This trail of thought, however, did not have the backing of the Soviet Union, and so splits emerged between the Soviet communists and the movement that became known as Eurocommunism. The Eurocommunist movement avowedly rejected the subordination of all communist parties to the once prevalent Soviet doctrine of one monolithic world communist movement. Instead, every communist party was expected to base its policies on the traditions and needs of its own country. The French communists briefly considered Eurocommunism, but in the end abandoned it and continued following the Soviet line, a decision which may have helped contribute to their continued decline. On the other hand, the Italian Communist Party remained Italy's second largest party, partly by stressing its independence from Moscow. The policies and sympathies of Eurocommunists eventually became so revisionist that they seemed to lie more with the European Social Democrats and Labour parties. In 1991, the Italian Communist Party even changed its name to the Democratic Party of the Left. Meanwhile, After the democratic revolutions of 1989, almost all of the communist parties of Eastern Europe became social democratic parties, either in spirit or name. Eurocommunism, in one aspect, had become the norm, but on the other hand, the Eurocommunists' plan of treading a new course between social democracy and Soviet-style communism had failed. To conclude, Gaullism and Eurocommunism represented ways in which Europeans attempted to seize control of their own destiny back from the Cold War superpowers. However, both movements had significant weaknesses and in many respects were too clever for their own good. European publics saw the Cold War in a good versus evil divide, or didn't care enough about politics to really embrace a third way at all. In the end, at the negotiations that brought an end to the Cold War, it was the actions of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and US President Bush that continued to be the most important.